Good evening and welcome to the Dr. Lake Show. This is Dr. Paola Lake. Very happy to be here today with Dylan Soriano Powling, my wonderful assistant who's been present right from the beginning of our establishing this show. Hello, Dylan. How are you doing?
Good, great. How are you, Paula?
I am pretty good. Having a good day so far. Glad it's still Sunday. I have a little bit of time still to myself before I launch into tomorrow. What about you?
I'm doing, awesome. I had a mouse running around yesterday, so I managed to get rid of that. That's about it.
And you manage that with equanimity and calmness, right? Since we're talking
At the time,
maybe
not.
Maybe not. Well, we're allowed
Yeah,
to have our emotional moments, right? Which ties into what this show is about today. We have been talking about in the last few episodes the idea of emotional intelligence, which has been a nice framework for just understanding overall functioning on different dimensions of our I guess, how we express ourselves, how much we're aware of ourselves, and how we operate in relationship. And just for those who haven't tuned in previous episodes, for those who are not aware of the concept of emotional intelligence, it's one that's pretty broad. It's out there. It's just a matter of even looking online and you will be inundated with information on emotional intelligence. It's been applied a lot to the business workplace. And I pretty well think it sums up to what I do as a psychologist. Is we elevate emotional intelligence, and sometimes it's a long process, sometimes it's a short one. Last episode, we did talk about one of the components, which was self-awareness, and not quite as easy as we think it is. Mostly we are aware of the things we do. We're aware maybe of things that we're thinking. I think on an average level, we all have some level of self-awareness. If we don't have any self-awareness, then it'll be definitely difficult to get through life. So the question then is, how do we develop self-awareness? And I'd like to talk a little bit about some questions that you can do, some techniques you can do in establishing and developing your own self-awareness. I alluded to some last session and I named off a couple, but I actually like to take you through a couple short exercises. And then we'll follow it with an introduction to the concept of self-regulation, which really refers to how do we regulate ourselves, our mood? Are we able to manage, or do we fly off the handle? Do we sink into the depths of depression? Are we able to motivate ourselves? Those are really, really important topics. I think probably it would be the bulk of my show for the majority of meetings I have will be having some reference to how can we learn to regulate. But before we launch into that, I'd like to talk a little bit of self-awareness. I don't know if you had any reflections since our last talk last time, Dylan?
That's, I think one of the things I was mentioning about self-awareness last week was you don't really know how self-aware you are. And even through our discussion last week, it just made me more cognizant, I suppose, of a lot of those attributes. So
we don't know. And we talked a little bit last time about blind spots. I think honestly, we all have blind spots. You might have remembered certain times in the past when you reflect back and you're able to recognize the space you were coming from when you were handling a certain situation. For example, you might look back at a certain period in your life and you'll go, I was really needy in that time. Looking back, I really see how needy I was. But at the time that you were experiencing that, you may not have been aware of it. And so we're not, sometimes 2020, we say we have 2020 vision. We can go back and look at a time period and be clear about what was going on. And I think one of the reasons is once we've established a certain distance from an experience, it's easier to see it. I don't know how many of the listeners have experienced themselves perhaps going away. It could be going away on a trip or completely removing themselves for a period of time from the situation in which they were absorbed or wrapped up in. And as they created that little bit of distance, somehow they're able to grasp a different perspective on the experience, or perhaps not to be as emotionally hooked into it. And the minute that you're not, you're able to see certain aspects of the situation and be aware of perhaps how things have triggered you a little bit easier than when you're completely wrapped in it. So the closer something is to us, perhaps the harder it is to see. And I think one example is family dynamics. And we all have certain family dynamics, patterns in the family. And we get the more wrapped up we are with our family and the expectations, we may not have a clear picture of whether it's a healthy situation because we're so immersed in it. I've seen that also for women who may have found themselves in abusive situations. They may not always know how they get there and what keeps them there. They're not always aware of those subconscious drives that are motivating them. That's why this matters. So the question then is, which we touched on a couple of them, is how do we get emotional awareness? I did mention that this isn't something that you achieve and then finally you reach a point of pinnacle that you say, "I'm now a fully self-aware person." This is,
Yeah,
it's
all
a,
done.
it's an ongoing thing. You're better off in life having some level of self-awareness than none. And of course, I don't know how feasible it is for us to have complete self-awareness of our dimensions because we are living in our own minds as humans. So what does it involve exactly to be self-aware? I touched on that last last episode. One of the things I mentioned is sitting, reflection, meditation, getting to know yourself, getting to know thoughts. And, there's probably a myriad of approaches for people to develop some level of self awareness. But today I'm just going to focus on a couple. I think it'd be a fairly lengthy list if I was to go through through a number of them. I want to perhaps introduce you to a couple strategies. One of them, I'm going to ask you some questions. And these questions are really there for you to reflect about yourself. So it might be best to reflect when you find a nice quiet spot. It's often best to put yourself in an environment where you can actually relax to the best of your ability, or there's not a lot of external stimulation. And sometimes we get distracted by that. And to have it be a safe place. I think if we're not in a safe environment, it's that much more difficult to practice self-awareness. So as you're sitting, and I'm going to ask some questions, and some of these come from forum that you can find different forums online, just asking some questions about your feelings. And this will give you some idea. Where am I at on that spectrum of self-awareness? At least you can start asking these questions, and if you can answer them, you have a better idea. So this is a statement, and I'd like you to reflect on whether this statement applies to you. I am often confused and puzzled about what I'm feeling. I are you able to identify what you're feeling? Do you struggle to name the feeling? And that's an important question. If you're not able to name what you're feeling, and we all can say I'm angry, sad, mad, glad. But when we're precise, are you able to articulate what that edge of that feeling is? Is there distress, hope, depression? Have you been feeling down? And so these are opportunities for you to do a little bit of a check-in with yourself. Take a moment, breathe, and you can even check in your body and ask yourself, what am I feeling right now? Am I able to identify feelings? Am I comfortable sitting by myself? I know some people that are actually quite uncomfortable sitting by themselves in silence. Really important for them to distract themselves, and there might be a reason for that. And that's a question you can actually ask yourself. What is it about quiet time that makes me uncomfortable? I think we, as humans, we have an impulse to always be doing and being engaged in activity and distracting ourselves with television and with different stimuli. And if it's hard for you to sit with yourself, do you know what that's about? Maybe that's a time when all these thoughts and feelings surface for you. And, other questions you can ask yourself when I'm angry and upset, do I understand why I'm angry and upset? Do I have an idea what triggers me? What's my pattern? So I actually asked a woman one day, and she was a client many years ago that I'd seen. And this was a question that was intended to expose a little bit more self-awareness. And I asked her, if you were to imagine a posture, a physical position that you could place yourself in relationship to how you relate to other human beings, how you relate to the people around you, what posture would you imagine having? And her answer to me was, I would be sitting on my knees, looking up at them and saying, please like me. And I thought that was a really powerful statement and recognition for her to see how she relates to people. And that's a self-awareness exercise. It had her step outside of herself for a moment and think about how she relates to people, how she feels when she is interacting with others. And those are the types of questions we want to ask ourselves. It might be important to know if you have patterns in your life. We all have patterns. There might be certain types of people that bother you or trigger you. There might be lots of situations that get you upset. Are you aware of what it is about those situations? When do you tend to get more upset? Is it when you're busy and stressed? Or is it when you're interacting with people in particular? So taking that time and find out what your patterns are. We all have patterns. I may have patterns. I remember years ago, especially when I was dealing with people that had anger and that were in angry states, I certainly was aware of feelings that would come up for me in the presence of someone who's angry. And I took some time to ask questions. What is it that upsets me so much when I'm around someone who's in that angry state? Am I worried for safety? So those are inventory ways to find out about yourself. Journaling can help with that. It may not grab at the blind spots, but it may help you recognize just patterns that you have, even patterns in thinking. I'm sure, Dylan, you've met some people that you've recognized as not having a lot of self awareness.
Oh, for sure. I even think about like just myself, not to be selfish, but um, reflecting on like my own patterns. When you do identify them, it's kind of scary when you like realize, oh, there's something that I've been systematically doing that's been beyond my control. So it seems.
So it
Um,
seems, yeah.
so once you've identified one of those patterns, um, where do you go from there?
Now where we're moving into is first the recognition of it, and I think once
Hmm.
we've recognized it, then we work in towards self the regulation of it. The very
Yeah.
first step to anything is recognizing what a pattern is. It could be, even patterns. I've certainly met people that have patterns of getting angry a lot on a daily basis, or they're very easily triggered by people. They fly into rages. And it can be easy for them to say, I know I'm angry. Well, that's easy. What's really challenging is knowing what drives that anger. What are some of the thoughts and beliefs that you carry that drive that anger? Perhaps that's time to sit with someone and to ask yourself what that is. For example, one thing I do work on heightening for people is their awareness of thinking patterns. And we all have thinking patterns. Sometimes I encounter people who do a lot of overgeneralizations and they make lots of global statements about themselves and others. Everyone's rude, nobody's kind, I can never get what I want. Very global statements. And if we're not aware of certain, perhaps dysfunctional thinking patterns we have, it's much harder to manage our emotions. So I think that's an important step in self awareness. And if you tend to lean towards depression, anxiety, um, maybe even fear, that typically there's some kind of cognitive thinking error there. And we all have thinking errors. But what I see is when we're more anxious, depressed, and fearful, that those thinking errors are perhaps more extreme and more frequent. Um, Thinking errors we tend to run into, especially when we're triggered and our frontal lobe is shut down. So, those are just some thoughts about self awareness and questions you can ask yourself. I wrote down a few more questions. Uh, are you even aware of perhaps the impact that your past has had on you? Are you carrying something from the past? Do you have some unresolved stuff? Like, are you carrying resentments? That's a really important thing to know because if you're carrying hurt and resentments, it may be impacting how you're relating to people today. And the value of changing that or recognizing is that we cannot change anything we don't recognize. So if I don't name something, and don't recognize it, it's the probability of changing it is very slim. I always think about Alcoholics Anonymous. That one of the things they really emphasize is the acknowledgement of the problem of being an alcoholic. We're not in denial of this issue anymore, and at the very extreme level of lack of self-awareness is denial. And sometimes denial serves a function, whether it's an illness, it's literally turning a blind eye to even being aware of a problem that's in front of you. And I think it is important to have some element of desire to unravel how things impact you, and in order to become clear about what drives you. So those are some ideas about self-awareness. There is one technique in particular I'd like to guide people towards. Um, and it's called focusing. Focusing originated by Genlin. And this is a way of going inward. I'm speaking right now to those of us, and I think we've all had those moments when we're feeling something, angry, upset, maybe hurt, but we can't really name it. We're feeling anxious inside, or we might feel some tension. And becoming self-aware means becoming aware of what's happening in your body. Feelings are held in the body. So if I'm angry, I might tighten up. If I'm sad, I might feel low energy and I feel drained. If I'm worried, I might be restless. The body and the mind are intricately connected. There is really no separation. Historically, physicians and in the medical profession, and when we were at the peak of idealizing empiricism, which means research and validating through proof. There was a period where we disconnected the mind from the body, and we actually looked at the brain as if it was irrelevant, really. And as the years have gone on and we learned brain research, it's become highly relevant. So that's why we're doing this. And how do you feel about going through a short little exercise there, Dylan?
I think it was awesome.
Okay.
Um, yeah, it's the more aware of self awareness you are, and then the more tools you have. It's working for me. Like I'm so fortunate that we get to like hang out and talk about this stuff because it helps a lot. Yeah.
Well, and I feel blessed as well because, I look at awareness as a relevant topic, not only on an individual level, but even awareness on a political level and awareness of how we. I know that if you know in some of the more dictatorship types of countries where they prohibit communication about certain things, they don't have room for people to talk about differing ideas and beliefs, partly for encouraging, promoting that controlling atmosphere. But it actually, if we're not aware of what's happening around us and how we're feeling about it, we're less likely to act on it. That's why awareness is so important. The more we heighten our awareness, we can perhaps even contribute to change in the world, in ourselves. So, this is a worthy practice. So, this short exercise, I'm going to be very short with it because I'm imagining there may be some people who are not comfortable always sitting quietly by themselves or in a moment of reflection. But I will be just playing a bit of a sound in the background. And with that, I'd like you to just see if you can find a nice spot just to sit, and that's relaxing and that feels safe enough for you. And we are going to take that moment right now, and I just want you to sit and breathe. And for a little moment, just focusing on your breath. You can hear the sounds in the background. And just focus on the breath. And your mind may wander, and the chances are your mind wanders. And I want you to make any experience you have at this moment okay. No judgment. You're just observing. You're breathing into the belly. And with each breath you take, just let your body relax a little deeper. With each inhale you take, sense your muscles relaxing. With each exhale, just imagine yourself releasing the tension. And because this is a self-awareness exercise, it's just a moment to sit with yourself and just do a check-in with your body and see what's your body feeling right now. Do you notice tension or tightness? If you notice tension or tightness, how long has that been present for you? Moment to see if relaxation has been difficult for you. Are you pulled by your thoughts right now? Are there any preoccupations that are difficult to put aside as you're sitting with your breath? Where does your mind tend to wander? And this is important in this practice, is that you become aware of any judgmental thoughts you may have. And if you notice a feeling that is unpleasant, just breathe into it. Really wanting to help people become aware of the connection between the tension in their body and thoughts that they're having. So there is no judgment in this process. Now, where people hold feelings mostly is in the chest area, so, and sometimes in the belly. And if you have any feelings that you're aware of, you can even ask yourself some questions like, if this feeling had a color, what color would it be? Is it tight in the chest, or is it swirling with anxiety? And as I work with people, and of course, this is not replacing a therapeutic process, we begin to put some names to that internal experience that you're having. And this is a great window for learning self-regulation, is to first start by becoming self-aware. If there was an upset, usually a question I ask people is, when did it start? Did you start getting upset? Was it in the morning? Were you in the middle of a conversation with someone and upset for that period of time? And then you can start to unpack this is especially potent if you're working with someone. What was it that upset you? What were you thinking? What happened? And this is a launching ground for self-regulation, because as you become aware of where your thoughts go and where your feelings go, it becomes much easier to know what you can change, to know what you need. And these kinds of exercises right now, I do encourage people. There's an app I think is absolutely lovely. It's called 10% Happier. It's by a number of different meditators. They provide exercises that you can do at night, in the morning, and deal with lots of emotion, and it will help with self-awareness. They're guided meditations, and they can be very helpful in helping you not only become self-aware, but even working towards self-regulation. I don't know if you were able to engage in a little bit of that, Dylan, the
Oh,
exercise?
definitely. Yes.
Okay, so
It is like, even just like hearing like, oh, is like there any tension in your body? Like, oh, sure is. What's going on? Like, yeah, there's a lot going on that you're not really aware of, that you just deal with.
There's a lot
Um,
going on that we're not aware of.
yeah,
And, the list of what you can do to heighten your awareness is pretty broad, and you can go in as much depth as you're willing to. I think the more you want to be in depth and understand your patterns, you might want to connect with a professional to help guide you because they have the skills and the technique to take you there. I think all those, we have a lot of resources now, especially with online and internet, where you can access books and lots. I think the hard part is because there's a myriad of material out there, people don't know where to go and where to start and which one is valid. Or I think a starting point is even just starting to access a resource. And sometimes people, such as myself, I will do my best to provide resources. There are books on focusing by Genlin, and what has where it's been really useful. It's a technique that I actually use for self-regulation. We just did a very minimal exploration on looking inward. So these are some of the things for self-awareness that I think at some point we will make ourselves available for people to contact in the case they have questions to leave with us on any of the
yeah.
topics that we cover. Yeah.
If you do want to like leave a comment, you can head to anchor.fm/dr lake, DRLAKE. That's a good chance where you're listening to us too. They do have a place to leave little voice messages, and we'd love to hear them.
And
So
I
totally
think
do that.
an equal one would be info@drlake.ca.
Yeah, even just
If
like,
there's a question there that anybody has,
yeah,
you're certainly
just
welcome.
email us. Yeah.
This is depth versus breadth. And depth for me is when you go in depth with a topic. Breadth is the breadth of how much we're going to cover. And I'm always having to juggle between one or the other, depth versus breadth. So today we went a little bit more in depth about self awareness rather than just skimming over it. But honestly, it's a topic that we will be covering throughout the course of these shows that we talk about. So I think maybe I'll do a quick talk about self-regulation, but we'll launch
Yeah,
into
you
it.
want to
We'll launch into it
go into it?
next time. How does that sound?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think we should just touch it fairly quick this time around. We really like
We're,
it's good
we covered
that we
it with
did that.
depth, yes.
Yeah,
So why does it matter? I For me, I think this is probably the one thing that matters the most. I think about a road rage. Road rage is the epitome of not having emotional self regulation. And,
letting it go on some random stranger, especially when you don't even see them.
well, it's,
Someone you'll never see again in your life.
here's a way I think about it. We're all emotional regulators to some extent, to some degree or another. We are all emotional regulators, and we're all seeking to feel good. That's why we there's as many self-help books out there as there are because people are looking for something. I think people are hungry for looking for ways to feel happier, more peaceful. They're looking for ways to feel less depressed, to manage their anger. This is central, I think, to all our functioning, central to our functioning on an individual, familial level, and central to the functioning between countries. If I look at the concept of emotional regulation in the Middle East, I'd say that we're struggling in that department, or there's lots of different areas. People might ask questions about our political, someone like Trump, whether there's emotional regulation in that department. So there's
Yeah,
emotional regulation is an important topic, and it is a fairly straightforward concept, which we're not going to really go into today, but we will cover it for next time. It's something that helps you manage impulsive responsiveness. So those of us that are more impulsive are probably less likely to be able to regulate. Regulation, by the way, just means being able to regulate a feeling, to bring it down, to contain it, to not be completely driven by a feeling to the extent that it takes over. Emotional regulation is so important in communication. That's probably, I think it's the heart of why we have violence in our society, the heart of why we have spousal abuse in our society is when there's a lack of emotional regulation. So it really also allows us to live a better quality of life. If I'm managing my emotion and I'm not being driven by them, chances are I'm going to be able to live in the moment more and enjoy being with people. I won't be always preoccupied. I think we all know people that are always upset about something or always complaining or something is always getting to them. It's harder to live in the moment. You can see that it's much harder to live in a state of gratitude when I'm taken up by a feeling. And even chronic stress, we know, is one of the number one issues in our society. I wouldn't say that we've taken a full handle on chronic stress in our society. Stress apparently is 60% of the conditions that end up showing themselves at the medical physician's office. One thing to keep in mind, emotional regulation, managing emotions, also keeps this frontal lobe online. So it means the more regulated I am, the more my brain is online. When we're flooded, there's actually a term called emotional hijacking. And I would say someone who is in a road rage state would be emotionally hijacked. That means they're hijacked by their emotions. The emotion center is in the limbic system. It's the center of the brain. There's a place called the amygdala. Some people call it the lizard brain. When we're emotionally hijacked, that part of the brain is essentially intensifies with activity, and the activity in the other higher cortical parts of the brain start to, let's say, go offline. And that's why when we're not emotionally regulated, we say things we don't mean. When we're in a state of real heightened upset, we do things we don't necessarily mean to do. That's probably, we're not as in control of our behavior. So emotional regulation is probably at the heart of my show. And I think that, and another piece I think why is important, it also helps with goal achievement. How many people have struggled to achieve a goal because they lack confidence in themselves or they're extraordinarily fearful and they don't know how to manage that fear? Public presentations is a number one fear that exists that we are aware of in the public, and which usually means we don't end up doing the things that make us uncomfortable and that step us out of our comfort zone, which could have an impact on the careers and choices we make because we live in this safe, contained place. And it is a form of emotional regulation, is avoiding anything that upsets you. But it's not true emotional regulation because avoidance can also cut short some of the possible life activities that you could enjoy in life if the world gets really small. So that is essentially, I'm going to do an intro to emotional regulation, and that's what it is. I think we can talk about different techniques for it. Maybe I'll even introduce a couple of techniques for emotional regulating our emotions, but it is a broad topic. I will talk about it in future episodes, from dealing with everything from depression, anxiety, and even trauma. For those of us with more simple traumas, or perhaps not complicated with a whole history of trauma, sometimes emotional regulation can be picked up in a fairly reasonable amount of time. But the more adversity we face in life, I think it's a lifelong practice. But here's one thing I want to let people know, that if we're emotionally regulating ourselves, your overall health and well being will be considerably improved, and it's a worthy endeavor. So, one way to think about this is the way you think about being physically fit. It's not something you do for a day, for a month, or for a year. We're spending the rest of our lives learning to regulate our emotions. There are experiences that we may encounter over which we have no control, over which we render us feeling helpless. So, at some point in our lives, even if we're at a point right now where we can master our feelings well, adversity hits us when we least expect it. And this is where emotional regulation and knowing how to do it matters most. But even more importantly, even without having a trauma that you're needing to regulate, it is extraordinarily important for moving forward in life and feeling optimistic and being mobilized by the feelings that allow you to accomplish the things you want in life. So for me, this is probably one of the more important topics ever to discuss. And I think that's a
It's very,
mhm,
very much like a test that you need every aspect to pass. And if you're off, even in one point in your life, it can affect everything else
it
in
can
your life.
completely, and to varying degrees and severity. I think it's a topic that fascinates me because I think we're all in search of it. You know, some of us regulate through outside sources like drugs and addictions and distraction, and they all serve purposes in their own time, I think. But the more we have an intrinsic ability to feel that we can regulate our emotions, the less destructive we will be in our lives with others and with ourselves, of course. So I think that's a good place to close off, Dylan.
I think you're right.
Yeah. So thank you for those of you tuning in. I'm really pleased to have been able to talk about this topic, and we will be continuing next episode on the topic of emotional regulation. And that's it for a night. Thank you all, and
All
thank you,
right.
Dylan. That's awesome always to
Thank you,
have you.
Paula.
And we will be meeting again next time. And I was going to put some music on for you because I thought you might appreciate a little bit of music here. But the music may or may not come, and there we go. So be it. All right, here we go. All the best to you. Have a wonderful day, evening, morning.